The photographs were the first thing I noticed. 10 years of our life together, gone from the hallway wall. Nothing left but faint rectangles of unfaded paint where they used to hang. I stood in my own front doorway with my duffel bag still on my shoulder and my cane pressed hard into the hardwood floor, and before my husband said a single word to me, I already knew something had ended. "Megan," Ethan said from the kitchen doorway, not moving toward me, "you're home early." Home early. After a flood recovery mission overseas that nearly killed me, after nerve damage that ended a 21-year Army career I loved more than almost anything in my life, after months of not knowing whether I'd ever walk with a limp again. Home early was what he said to me, standing in the house we'd built together, like I was a delivery he wasn't expecting until Thursday. I looked past him into the kitchen and saw the furniture rearranged, the couch pushed to a wall it had never touched in 10 years, and I felt the floor shift beneath me, even though I hadn't taken a single step. Ava ran to me first, my daughter, 10 years old, throwing her arms around my waist so hard I nearly lost my balance on the cane. For one moment, holding her, breathing in the smell of her shampoo, I let myself believe everything else was fine. Then I looked past her small shoulders and saw Ethan's mother, Patricia, standing in my kitchen, stirring a pot on my stove like she'd lived there for years. Welcome back to the family revenge tales. "We didn't want you to feel overwhelmed," Patricia said without turning around, "so I've been helping out while you adjust." That word, adjust, sat on the dinner table with us like an uninvited guest who'd pulled up a chair without asking. Nobody looked at me directly. Ava kept filling the silence with stories about her class hamster, about a spelling test, about anything that wasn't the tension thick enough to choke on. Patricia mentioned, almost casually, over the clink of forks against plates, that I'd probably need a walker soon, that insurance likely wouldn't cover a proper ramp, that life was going to look so different now. Ethan said nothing. He pushed his food around his plate like a man waiting for something to be over, and I sat there in my own home feeling like a guest who'd overstayed a welcome I never remembered receiving. After Ava went to bed, I found him sitting alone in the dark living room, the television off, just staring at nothing, and I asked him plainly what was going on. He didn't even flinch. "I filed for a divorce 2 months ago, Megan. I already have a lawyer." I felt the room tilt, not from my leg, from something deeper, giving out beneath me, some foundation I didn't know had already cracked while I was half a world away. "You couldn't tell me while I was still overseas? You had to wait until I walked through the door?" "I didn't know how to say it," he said. Then quieter, like it was supposed to soften the blow, "I can't do this. The hospitals, the therapy, not knowing if you'll ever really be you again. I need a normal life, Megan." Patricia appeared in the doorway, like she'd been waiting just out of sight the whole time, arms crossed, face set. "He deserves that. You have to understand." I didn't argue. I didn't cry, not yet. Something in me had gone very still and very quiet, the way it used to before a difficult mission, when there wasn't room left for panic. I packed 2 bags, gently woke my sleeping daughter, told her we were going on a little adventure, and by midnight we were driving through a mountain storm with nowhere to go. 21 years of my life sitting in the rearview mirror like wreckage I couldn't stop staring at. There was only one place I could think to go, my father's ranch, just outside Cody, Wyoming. I hadn't set foot on that land in almost 20 years. My father, Samuel Whitaker, had passed away years earlier, and I'd let the ranch sit empty because going back meant admitting how long I'd stayed away, and admitting that felt like its own kind of grief. We drove through the night. Somewhere around the Wyoming state line, Ava finally fell asleep against the window, And I just kept driving, hands tight on the wheel, Ethan's voice looping in my head. Need a normal life. As if I'd chosen this. As if 21 years of service had been a burden instead of a promise I'd made and kept, mission after mission, deployment after deployment, while he stayed home and slowly decided I wasn't worth the wait. When we finally pulled up the long gravel drive just before sunrise, I nearly stopped the car in disbelief. The porch light was on. Nobody had lived there in years, but it glowed there in the gray morning light, warm and steady against the fading dark, and standing beneath it was George Holloway, my father's oldest friend and our closest neighbor for as long as I could remember. He didn't ask why I was there. He didn't ask about the swelling in my leg or the exhaustion written across my face. He just walked down those porch steps, wrapped his arms around me, and said, "Your father always told me you'd come back when you needed to. I've been keeping that light on for longer than you'd believe." Then he handed me an old leather satchel, worn soft at the edges from years of handling. Across it, in my father's unmistakable handwriting, were the words, "For Megan, only when she finds her way home." Inside were sealed envelopes, handwritten ledgers, legal documents, and a stack of labeled cassette tapes, each one dated and organized with the same careful precision my father brought to everything he touched. I sat at his kitchen table that first morning, Ava asleep in the next room, sunlight slowly filling the windows, and I began listening. What I heard broke my heart and rebuilt it in the same breath. My father's voice, warm and steady, exactly the way I remembered it from childhood, explaining things I never knew he'd noticed. He talked about Ethan's visits to the ranch, years before we were even married, how Ethan rarely asked about me during those visits. He asked about acreage, about water rights, about what the land might be worth someday, phrased carefully, casually, like a man testing the depth of water before deciding whether to wade in. My father never confronted him. He simply started documenting everything, quietly, patiently, year after year, tape after tape. "I'm not doing this because I believe Ethan is a bad man," his recorded voice said, and I could hear the ranch sounds behind him, wind against the porch, a dog barking somewhere far off. "I'm doing it because I love my daughter more than I trust anybody's promises." For years, he'd worked with an attorney named Richard Prescott, updating legal protections, requiring Ethan to sign documents acknowledging he would never inherit any part of Whitaker Ranch. My father had prepared for outcomes he prayed would never come. One envelope if I came home happy, one if I came home alone, one if anyone ever tried to challenge what he'd built. He had planned for decades, not out of suspicion, but out of a kind of love I didn't fully understand until I was sitting in his kitchen with nowhere else to go and nothing left but his voice on an old cassette tape. That morning, I decided I wasn't going to sell the ranch. I was going to bring it back to life. It wasn't easy. My leg didn't cooperate with fence posts or barn roofs, and some mornings I sat on the edge of the bed for 10 minutes just working up the will to stand. Every morning began before sunrise with physical therapy exercises that left me gripping the porch railing, tears running down my face from pain I refused to let win. There were days I wanted to quit. Days I sat in my father's truck in the driveway and just cried, exhausted, furious at my own body for betraying me twice in 1 year. But Ava became my shadow through all of it. She learned to patch fencing before she learned a long division, and she never once complained, not even when her small hands got blistered from the wire. "You don't have to be perfect at this, Mom," she told me one afternoon, handing me a hammer with more confidence than any 10-year-old should have. "Grandpa wasn't perfect either. George told me." One afternoon, digging through my father's old workshop, she found a small recorder tucked behind a shelf of tools, one that not even George had known existed. We sat together on the workshop floor and played it. My father's voice filled the room, and this time, he wasn't speaking to me. "Ava," he said, "if you're listening to this someday, thank you for helping your mother smile again." Neither of us said a word for a long time after that. We just sat there, my arm around her shoulders, listening to the tape hiss quietly in the silence, dust drifting through a shaft of afternoon light between us. Word travels fast in a small Wyoming county, and it wasn't long before people started showing up, unannounced, the way neighbors used to before anyone had a phone to call ahead. Veterans I'd never met, volunteer firefighters, neighboring ranchers who remembered my father fondly and said so, one after another standing in my driveway with tools in their hands. A handful of FFA students from the local high school arrived on a Saturday morning without being asked twice, led by their teacher, who told me my father had once donated fencing supplies to the program without ever mentioning it to a soul. Over one unforgettable weekend, they rebuilt what would have taken me a year alone. Fences went up, the barn roof was replaced board by board, the corral, half collapsed for a decade, stood straight again by Sunday evening. Someone brought a folding table full of food, someone else brought a guitar, and as the sun went down, a couple of the older ranchers sang songs I hadn't heard since childhood, sitting on overturned buckets like it was the most natural thing in the world. I stood in the middle of the noise and sawdust, leaning on my cane, and cried in front of strangers for the first time since I'd come home. Not from sadness, from something closer to relief. Among them was a craftsman named Jacob Bennett, who noticed my father's old woodworking tools sitting untouched in the workshop, dust thick across the workbench, cobwebs strung between the vise and the wall. "Your dad built half the furniture in this county," he told me, running his hand along an old table saw with something like reverence. "Seems a shame to let his tools go quiet." That conversation became something real. Within months, with Jacob's guidance and George's steady encouragement, I'd started Whitaker Ranch Woodworks, building handcrafted furniture in the same workshop my father once used. Sawdust in my hair most evenings, sore hands that ached in a way that finally felt earned instead of stolen. Orders began arriving from towns I'd never visited. For the first time since leaving the army, I felt like I hadn't just found a house to live in. I'd found a life. Then, almost a year later, Ethan showed up in my driveway, holding flowers in one hand and a gift bag for Ava in the other. "I've been in counseling," he said, standing awkwardly by his car, not quite meeting my eyes. "I know I made a mistake, Megan. I want to fix this, Megan." For one weak, foolish second, I saw the man I'd married standing there. Then Patricia's car pulled in right behind his, and she stepped out already talking about how valuable the land must be now, how we could all start fresh if we simply sold it and split things fairly. I understood in that instant exactly why he'd really come back. Before I could say anything, Ava stepped between us, looking up at her father with a question that silenced the whole yard. "Dad, when Mom got hurt, why did you stop being proud of her?" Nobody spoke. Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it again. He looked down at the gravel. I watched the man who had once promised to love me in sickness and in health stand there with absolutely nothing to say to his own daughter. The silence stretched long enough that even the wind seemed to pause, long enough that I heard a hawk somewhere overhead, long enough that Patricia finally looked away first. I told him, gently, that forgiveness didn't mean rebuilding something he chose to destroy. I wished him healing. And then I closed that door for good, quietly, without slamming it, because I didn't need to anymore. He didn't take it well. A few months later, I was served with legal papers. Ethan was suing, claiming my father hadn't been mentally competent when he established the ranch trust. I later learned through George that Ethan had approached him privately before the trial, offering him money in exchange for my father's recordings and asking him to change his testimony. George refused on the spot and went straight to Richard Prescott instead. The trial didn't take long. Richard laid out every document my father had prepared. The ledgers, the loan records, the signed waivers Ethan had put his own name on years earlier. And then, in a courtroom gone completely silent, he played my father's final recorded statement, the one meant for exactly this moment. My father's calm, steady voice explained, without a trace of bitterness, why he'd built every protection he had, not because he hated Ethan, because he loved me enough to prepare for anything, even this. I watched Ethan's face while the recording played. He didn't look angry. He looked, for the first time in a long while, like a man finally seeing himself clearly. Even the judge sat quietly for a moment before ruling. The case was dismissed, permanently, with no room for another attempt. Justice, I learned, doesn't always arrive loud. Sometimes it arrives as patience, kept safe in an old leather satchel for 20 years, waiting for the right moment to speak. The following spring, the ranch was thriving again. My business had grown steadily. Ava flourished in school and helped with the animals every chance she got, proud in a way that made my chest ache with gratitude. That first year, our community started a tradition we now call Whitaker Heritage Day, honoring veterans, neighbors, and the values my father spent his life quietly protecting. Ava raised the flag that morning, while a row of veterans stood at salute, and I stood beside George, who didn't say anything, just squeezed my shoulder once. That evening, she and I planted a young maple tree beside my father's grave. As the sun dropped behind the hills, I played his last recording one more time. "If this ranch is filled with laughter again," his voice said, soft and sure, "then I know you found your way home. I couldn't walk beside you forever, sweetheart, so I spent my life building something that could." Standing there beside my daughter under that little tree, I finally understood. My father's greatest gift was never the land or the money or the ranch itself. It was the quiet, patient love that gave me the strength to stand back up when everything else fell apart around me. If this story moved you even a little, please consider subscribing to the Family Revenge Tales. We tell stories about the families who hurt us and about the ones who quietly, faithfully, never stopped showing up. No matter how far you fall or how many people walk away when things get hard, there is always a way to rebuild. And sometimes, the people who loved you best were protecting you long before you ever knew you needed it. What is the significant educational or other value in this story? This story speaks to the quiet strength of unconditional love, especially the kind that plans ahead without ever asking for credit. It shows how greed and self-interest can hide behind the language of love, and how patience and documentation, not anger, are often the strongest forms of protection against betrayal. It teaches viewers that a parent's foresight can become a child's shelter years later, even after that parent is gone. It also reminds us that community and honest work can restore not just a home, but a sense of self-worth after devastating loss. Above all, it offers hope that resilience, family loyalty, and truth ultimately outlast deception and abandonment.